if you have questions. Yeah.
Oh, I'll pop them in. Yeah, I don't. It's record. It's not. I'll edit this part out, but I got it started recording now. It's not like you have anything to hide, or it would, or anyone knows you enough for me to ask you any controversial question.
Yeah, exactly right. I'm not running for politics, right? So
No. This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com, and today we have kind of a combat sports related guest because he is a former All American wrestler, very decorated amateur wrestler, one of my former amateur wrestling coaches, but now he's an author and a podcaster. His website is below lighterthanpapers.com. Kevin Stemp, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm pretty good. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate this.
This actually isn't your first appearance on the Hannibal TV. I covered a amateur wrestling tournament now that has almost 5,000 hits. It was Crean Wilson against your school, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and another school. And I interviewed you for that. It was a dual meet. Are you still coaching wrestling?
No, I actually transitioned out of coaching just prior to the lockdowns and the pandemic. So last time I was on the mat was I think it would have been 2020, right? Just in the new year, I stepped down, and then of course we get slammed with a pandemic and everything kind of shuts down. But yeah, that was the last time I coached.
Yeah, and for the fans that don't know my history, I used to amateur wrestle. I was a junior national champion and the equivalent of state champion. And one of the reasons I did so well was because you just finished your university career and you were about the size of a high school heavyweight.
Yeah.
And I was practicing with you when I was still in high school. So you're a former All American. I believe you were a national champion in Canada too.
No, I
No?
my I have to live with the fact that I never made a national final actually in any of the national championships I was in, but that's neither here nor there. I'll take the everything but first or second. But no, I never made it to a national final. So
You went to Simon Fraser University, which is the top amateur wrestling school in Canada, or was for years. So many big amateur wrestling stars came out of there, including Daniel Agali, the Olympic gold medalist, back in I think the year 2000. But they had a special deal where they competed in the NAIA at the time rather than the Canadian CIAU uh, university circuit. So you have experience in the NAIA. How was that wrestling in the U.S.?
it was fantastic. I think it was an incredible opportunity. The American approach to wrestling is brilliant. The way that it is actually got the spotlight it deserves. Lots of competitors. One of the things, as you mentioned, that stands out in my mind is my coach Mike Jones. First time I won my first collegiate match, I was at Douglas College at the time, so I went to college first and then transferred to university. And he came up to me and he was all excited. So he's like, "What's it like to get your first collegiate win?" Right? Because in Canada we're freestyle, right? So we don't know that style. So to go down there and have to learn it, was cool. But actually, to round the story around it, I actually competed in Dayton, Ohio. I lived in the United States for 4 years. My father was in the military, so we were posted in Ohio for 4 years, and I got my taste of collegiate wrestling actually in grade 9. So that's how I first started with the sport. Aside from sometimes people get exposed in like grade 7 and 8 in a gym class, but my first collegiate match was actually I was in the JV team, and it was pretty cool. So, but to answer your question, competing down there was great. I loved it. I think I had American teammates too, so that was also brilliant, right? This sort of merging of our tribes and going down there and competing, and it's fun collegiate, right? It's a different game, right? You have to actually, you're constantly in motion, and there's constant attempts to escape. Whereas in freestyle, the last thing you want to try to do is get up off your stomach, and next you're thrown for 5 points, right? So, but it was a good experience for sure.
So how did you transition? I know you did a bunch of different jobs after you were finished university. How did you transition into becoming an author?
Well, when I was young, I came across a box at my parents that they had stowed away, and it was stories I wrote when I was a kid. I think I was in grade 4 or something. And one of my favorite things about school was when we got to do creative writing. So I was always writing those stories. So I came across one of those. That was kind of maybe my first point, is when I was, in fourth grade, and then I dabbled a bit in university, which, I guess the joke on me is that I was probably trying to write certain stories in the computer lab at the Simon Fraser University library basement, and I should have been working on my assignments, but I dabbled there and was writing, but nothing ever really took. And then I play Dungeons and Dragons, so there's a lot of aspects of creativity in that game, and you can be a player, which is basically you design a character and you're immersed in sort of what is a real story that you're interacting with. And then my friend taught me how to be what is called the dungeon master. And the dungeon master is very much someone that will create a world, right? Or will build on a world already in place. And there's a story that you create, and there's character interaction. So there's a lot of creative writing in that. So from there, I think the next point in time that I can think about when I started writing seriously is I was an elementary school teacher. So I did a master's in education in New York State, and I left the country for almost a decade. And while I was an elementary school teacher, I wrote 4 children's books. Those are the ones I think that we talked about in that last interview during that dual meet. So that was sort of my first foray into a completed product, because before, everything I wrote was just sort of this open-ended, never finished story, right? But these children's books, these 4 of them, I was able to start and finish them A to Z for completion. Um, and then the beauty of things like Web 2.0, you got Amazon, there's Kobo, and of course there's a whole plethora of other platforms where what is technically an independent author, an indie author, can actually put their work up, and it can be accessed by the wider population, versus, in the past, there's these gatekeepers around. I got a book, I want to publish it, but you have to sort of get it through an agent perhaps and get it to a publisher. So now I think what's really great about people that want to share their stories is there's these platforms now that you can put your stuff up live in it. And of course there's, you got to market it and you got to do this and that, but the gatekeepers are being removed. And then, the next level on this is Web 3.0, and I'm not going to get into too much weeds on it, but we're looking at, the crypto space, and we're looking at, how can authors get their books out as NFTs, which I'm exploring. I've got NFTs made now for my books, and there's places like Decentraland where you can go in these virtual worlds where authors can display their art or their books. So there's really this momentum now with the ability to both create but also get it out there, and get it into the hands of people that hopefully like to read it. So it's really an exciting time. Um, so to steer back to, I wrote those kids books, and then I'm like, well, maybe I felt like I'm going to try to dabble in writing for adults. And I thought maybe that would be a better niche to lean into. So I have been mostly writing for adults now, and started really my first novel. I think I started writing it in 2017, The Last Northman, and have gone on from there. So I write that under my adult stuff's under my real name, Kevin Stemp. And then I've got a pen name for the children's books, because they really shouldn't mix. So, that's kind of the journey in a nutshell, where it's taken me. So,
And speaking of adult books, this is your latest, The Last Northman. What can you tell us about this book? And for more information on these books, of course, lighterthanpapers.com.
this book, uh, it's going to appeal to people that like adventure, right, and people that like to explore. It's got a heavy element of exploration, and as we know, I mean, it's a Viking based book. So, as we know, culturally, the Vikings, or the Scandinavian people, the northern people, were traders, explorers, as much as they were pirates and conquering armies, right? So it is a book very much about getting out there. The main character is a young guy. He's, I think, about 60. He's seen 16 winters. That's actually one of the other main characters. That's Thornston the Far, is one of the main characters in the book. So he's almost 40 in the book, and he's the uncle of who was originally one of my main characters, called Rhaegark. And Rhaegark is this young guy, he's seen 16 winters, and his father's got his hand on him, holding him to their family farm, and his father's got experiences in the armies that basically invaded a lot of Europe, and the plundering, and his father's really just struggling to keep his son on the farm, and wants him to stay on the farm, but Rhaegark he just wants to sail, right? So he's seen the longships go out from the fjords, and he wants to be out there in the ocean, and it's a real struggle there. Eventually, there's a catalytic moment where Rhaegark breaks free from the farm, and then that's the story kind of just takes off in terms of that, and it's got elements of supernaturalness to it too. So I've combined certainly some fictitious elements, and I tried to keep it as best as I possibly could, realistic as well. So it's got those two elements. So
Have you always been interested in Vikings? I know there's a lot of wrestling fans and wrestlers that like Vikings, so
yeah, I
definitely.
think, yeah, I mean, probably, if I could go back in my mind, as a kid, I'm sure I loved medieval, right? I love sword and sorcery. Um, so those things really, really appealed to me. I got to do a lot of reading, both fiction and nonfiction, about Viking culture, and still consider myself a novice in that area, and I wouldn't claim to know everything, but I think the idea of what they did, right, and how far they went in many ways, that's part of that book, is just the extension of where they went. Without going into too much spoiler, I mean, they crossed the northern Atlantic in those boats, which, like, how is that humanly possible, right? How do you get through those waves? And there's a point in the book that I go into the stretch between Iceland and Greenland, and you're just like, how is this possible, right? So exploring that was interesting. I read a book that gave me some perspective too, called The Criminal History of Mankind, which was written by Colin Wilson. I think he's no longer with us, but it was basically a book that discussed the evolution of violence and crime in our species. And there's a segue to the Vikings, obviously, as there is in which we know, right? But it was a good experience to say, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that went on that you're like, holy shit. And then there's a lot of cultural slash, there's trade, there's the cultural influence that we have even in our modern day society, right? I think even, as I recall, some of the days of our week are based on Viking culture. And um, my brother-in-law jokes with me that there's probably something deeper than that. And I'm sure my Northern European heritage has got something to do with my interest in that sense. But otherwise, yeah, it's been a good journey.
What part of writing this book did you have the hardest time with?
So there's a scene that I wrote where one of the characters died, and I had become quite attached to this character for many reasons, largely his interpersonal relationships with some of the main characters. While he's a main character, but he is almost secondary or third to some of the other characters. There's a scene where he dies, and I remember I was working in Starbucks just down the street from my house, having a coffee and typing away, which is a great place to get creative, right? There's a lot of energy there, and I wrote this scene, and it was troubling to me that he was gone. And I came home. I think I told my girlfriend that so and so died, and in the story, and it just bothered me, the fact that this character died in the story, right? So that was a hard scene to write, because I think most authors probably have some attachment to their characters, and the one thing I've learned on both sides of the equation is to be able to kill off your characters can be very powerful for you as a writer, but also for your readers. And I think that's evident what we saw with George R. R. Martin. I mean, anybody that's read the Game of Thrones series probably really angry at some of the characters dying off, and then on the flip side, some authors that the characters never die, right? They seem to have this sort of way that they're going to be almost invincible, right? So for me, weighing that and saying, yeah, I'm able to kill off some of my characters has been a good experience. So, but a hard experience to do myself. So
And what was the most fun about writing this book?
I think it was the ability to craft interpersonal relationships in the story, right? So the way the characters interact with each other, the bonds that form, uh, just the I mean, the brotherhood, right? So all there's a Viking vessel that crosses quite wide and far, and it's comprised mostly of, it's all men, right? Which maybe that's an error. I'm sure there's probably, obviously there were women sailors, right, in these crews, but this story, they're all men, and there's a bond between these men, and it just made me think of, I mean, things reflective like being on a wrestling team, right, in a van with your teammates and just cruising, and the stories and the banter and the poking of fun, right? But then you go into these situations where you have to work together. So that was fun to write that, particularly as they sailed, certainly through some brutally treacherous waters, right? I mean, you had to have all hands on deck, and you had to work together as a team. The other thing I enjoyed is the cultural collisions that I started to either plant seeds for or write in the book. And collisions might not be the greatest word, but it basically means like cultures connecting, right? So this culture interacting with this cultures, and these cultures being so separated by time and distance, right? That was fun to write about what it was like, because certainly a seafaring trading culture goes wide and far, as we know from our history. So the interactions of that, both to the west and somewhat in the book I read about travels to the east as well from the Viking characters. So
Have you traveled to any of these places where the Vikings ruled back in the day? I kind of didn't pay any attention in high school. I have no idea how I made it through, so I don't even know anything about the history of Vikings.
yeah, it's been really fun to do research and continuously doing research. I just read a book. I'll probably answer this in a scrambled kind of way, but I just read a book called I think it's called The River Kings, and the author is an archaeologist writing about finding, I think, how did she write? So finding beads that might have been made in India, and finding them in burial sites, in Viking burial sites, right? So these artifacts. So for me, going to these places, not necessarily so. I mean, I do have an interest in the Middle East because I lived there for 2 years, and um, you know, Thornston the Far has, both in The Last Northman, discusses his journey there, but and then and writing another novel with him as the main character, and it's going to be about his what happens, right, going that far, right, and um, so the Middle East has been certainly something that's come through my writing to some degree, and I'm hoping I get it right and such. But I've never been to Norway or Iceland, and I would like to. I think on my bucket list, that's something that I would really enjoy doing someday. So maybe a matter of after writing. So there's that, yeah. But in terms of going places, perhaps only in my mind, and maybe through video games. Like I'm playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla right now, so not necessarily being there, but experiencing sort of the idea of these travels. So, but you can go places in your own mind, right? You can read books, and you can watch media, and that can take you there. But it's probably not as good as actually being in the actual place, but to some degree. So.
Do you think you would have gotten along with your main character in this book?
So Rhaegar, for sure, the young kid, 17 Summers. I think, I've traveled a lot. I was out of the country I was out of Canada for about almost 10 years, give or take, maybe a year or two. And I got quite addicted to traveling and new experiences, and going into some really, really strange situations culturally, but also, I'm there with my feet on the ground. And it to me, it's quite intoxicating, to the point where I was still feeling the reverberation of that long after. Like I've put down roots now back in my home city of Ottawa, Canada, and for a long time I sort of had this urge to explore and travel and see and do. And I have friends that are still doing it in different ways, so I get to live through them. And my girlfriend and I plan to do more traveling in the future. Obviously, things shut down for a little while there with the pandemic, but um, and then you know the next character, Thornston the Far, who I have to admit really, really captivated me more than any other character in The Last Northman. He and I think I like his wit. Like he in the book, he tried, his wit is trying to be sharp and fast, but humorous, certainly in dangerous situations. And his lust for travel as well, and to explore and go out beyond, is something that would resonate well with me if he and I were to perhaps sit at the same table and share stories. So, yeah.
You mentioned you did some of your writing in Starbucks where there'd be a lot of distractions for some people. I see you got an office there that's probably pretty quiet. Is there a certain environment that you write best in?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. So I don't think I have a formal diagnosis of ADHD, but I certainly have a very busy mind, and I certainly have shiny new things syndrome, if that's even a thing, but it basically means I can move from this to that to that. So sitting down in this office, I've done a lot of writing. So putting these on, and when I wrote The Last Northman, I listened to a lot of Metallica and Amon Emrath. I hope I'm saying that right, but listening to them, and I would YouTube Viking music, and you can get all kinds of great soundtracks with um, sometimes no lyrics, but sometimes lyrics, but I didn't understand it. So it was just to set that tone for my mind to stay focused. Um, I listened to Death Magnetic by Metallica a lot. Like that was my go-to channel, like music when I was writing. So that served that. Sometimes Injustice for All. So certainly having that kind of music in the headset and being able to plug away. Coffee helps. So getting fueled up on coffee, and just sort of carving out the time, right? Like making sure that no distractions creep in, and obviously will sometimes, but yeah. So that's it. I mean, basically that was it in a nutshell. Just to keep the focus, right? Is music, coffee, and sitting down in front of the computer. I mean, sometimes what I do is I set a timer, so I try to hit a word quota. Like I might try to hit 1,000 words, and I say to myself, okay, I got 45 minutes to do this, so I'll set a timer and I'll try to beat that, and it helps me stay focused and productive on the writing. So
Is there a particular author that's your favorite author?
yeah, I have a lot. Yeah, I like reading. I think probably read a lot more than I actually write, but um, it's also generational. So I think as a kid, I'm gonna put a shout out. I don't even know if these two guys are still alive, but Steve Livingston and Ian Jackson. I think that's those two guys wrote the final Fighting Fantasy series. So I think this was when I was in grade 4. My teacher told my mom that I need to read, and my mom was like, okay. Well, she used to take me to the library and we'd get books, and then I discovered they're choose your own adventure books, right? But these guys, this team of writers, there might have been other people on their team, but they must have wrote about 30 of these books. And I just that's all I wanted to do is consume those, right, as a kid, because it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons, but for simplified, because you get two six-siders, and then you read the book and it says, okay, if you do this, turn to this page. If you do that, turn to that page. And then sometimes you'd fight an orc or you'd fight something else, and you got to roll your dice. And they were quite wide. So they did fantasy, they did science fiction, they dabbled in a little Mad Max-ish, like Mad Max type, like Road Warrior type books. So as a kid, that was my takeoff point, where I'm like, I love reading. This is fantastic. I've read a lot of science fiction too. I think in my teen years and early 20s, I read a lot of the books written in the D&D genre, so Dungeons and Dragons genre. That whole area, you've got some really epic books in there, Dragonlance, those kind of books. Picked up some science fiction here and there. I like reading nonfiction too now. So, I think as I've aged, I enjoy a good historical novel or memoirs. Um, when I hit university, I read a lot of Anne Rice, so much to the point where I probably should have been studying, but I was too busy reading Anne Rice's novels and burned through those, which were fantastic. Um, so yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it's hard for me to pin down. I mean, I certainly read Tom Clancy. There's a writer named, I think his name is Andy McNabb. He was a Secret Air Service, I guess, a commando for the British Army, I think, and wrote about his experiences in war situations. So those appealed to me. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I could probably go on forever of what I read. But in terms of my favorites, favorite author. It's a tough question, but I think it's Anne Rice ultimately. If I was to pick it on the spot, it's probably Anne Rice. Just what she did in those books for the imagination and such was really good. So
Do you think any of your books would translate well to film? It seems like this one might.
yeah, I mean, I think that would be pretty cool. I don't even know where to start with that, but that's something maybe I can explore. But um, because I do sometimes consider animation, right, which seems I don't think it's cheaper to do, but might be easier to acquire versus actors and productions. But yeah, I would be open to that if that manifests, right? For sure, that would be pretty cool to see.
Any sequels in the works with all the buzz going about the last Nordstrom or
Yeah,
Nordsman? Sorry.
no, yeah, yeah, for sure. So I'm 6K into. It's not a sequel. It's actually it's a prequel. So it's basically about Thornston the Far, his journey before he shows up in the Last Northman. So he shows up in the Last Northman. He's probably almost 40. So he's had a life before that, and I'm gonna write about his experiences before that. And without too much spoiler, it's going to be a journey basically from what's now I guess the Baltic like region, all the way around, basically circumnavigating beyond, and he's going to end up in what is Baghdad in around nine. I'm not sure. I have to lay down the timeline because that's something I struggle with, is trying to get timelines right. But it'll be 900, and if I do the math right, maybe 980. He's going to land there. So I've been certainly reading about Baghdad in that time and such. But it's also going to have a supernatural element, because that's something I enjoy doing, is taking history and real figures, and hopefully that's okay, and mixing in some fantasy and even some gothic type stuff to make a story. So
Have you ever had a supernatural experience in real life?
yeah, I think so. I There was, sometimes our dreams are pretty powerful, so that's one thing. But there was a time when a couple things actually I'll mention. So I was visiting my sister. She was working in San Diego, and we were down there, and I was sleeping on her couch, and I think we were going surfing the next day, so I was pretty excited. So my sleep might not have been the greatest due to that excitement. But I remember kind of being lucid enough. But I don't know if you ever experienced it, but you're awake, but you can't move yet. So you're fully aware of your surroundings. You can even see, but your body can't move. And I remember looking over my shoulder, and there was this translucent thing in the chair beside me, just like it was like moving like a ghost, right? And I was quite terrified, actually. And like, okay, and maybe it's still a dream state, right? But I remember seeing that, and that was something that was like, I wonder what there is out there, right, beyond. Um, but there's something else that I found interesting. So I wrote a short story called Blood Mist, and I entered this contest. I've entered a few contests over time, and it was a contest called Survive the Night, by Dark Regions Press is the outfit that ran the contest. And basically, you had to write about three characters trying to survive a night of, and it's a horror outfit, right? So there's a horror story. You've got three characters that have to survive the night. Um, anyway, to back up in the book, at the start, there's a scene where this character I wrote in he had stolen from a an outfit, or a mob outfit, or just something like that, right? Where he had stolen from them, and they caught him, and he basically did some digital like hacks, right? He hacked in and stole them, and he doesn't. Things don't go well for him, right? And anyway, that's sort of the start of the story. But there's more to it. But I wrote that piece, and I was like, okay, and I'm dabbling in horror too. I like to write in horror and experiment. So that happened. I wrote it, and I think I had published it. I put it out, and um, I think, like, I don't know, it was not too long after I got hacked. Like, somebody broke into my accounts and just pilfered. I mean, I don't have a lot of money, so wasn't that bad, but they got in. And um, the reason why I can't really dismiss this as coincidence is, there's a guy named Alan Moore who's quite a prolific comic book writer, and I remember watching him in a podcast talk about these ideas of what you create in the fictitious world coming into the real world, right? In some ways. And there's a podcast or a talk that he does, and I might butcher it, but he's basically saying he's in a cafe and he's enjoying his coffee, and he's kind of watching people, and he said this guy came in and went up to the bar, and he kind of was a bit weirded out because the guy kind of looks like his character, and then the more he observed, he's like, that is my character, like I've written that guy. And I think, as I recall, he's like telling the story about this experience, and then he said the guy turned at him and winked at him, and it freaked him out because he looks at this person, and he's like, that is one of my characters. And I think it startled him. He said he got up and left. He was startled, right? So, does fiction come into the real world? I mean, there's people, I think, that think that, right? So being mindful of what you write can manifest. But I experienced it, and I was like, oh, this is just a bit weird, I'm like, the fact that I wrote about this guy hacking in, stealing money, and then he meets an untimely death, and next thing you know, I'm hacked. So I was like, anyway, so supernatural, who knows? I don't know.
What advice would you give to an aspiring writer?
Well, I think you have to know what you want, right? Like, if you just want to write and have maybe a bunch of unfinished manuscripts, and that's what you want, then that's okay, right? And if you want to write to completion, then there's things that can help with that. I mean, it's certainly consistency pays off. I think write, and just stay at it, right, and work at it, um, and combine with that, read, right? Like, you got to read a lot to know to have the ability to write, because your ideas come from that, or you learn about people that you can learn from the great writers, how they write. And I don't aspire to that. I aspire to what I call a cigarette model, which I want to create fast burning, easy to read fiction for everybody to be able to access and then just burn through it. I don't ever aspire to be this great prize winning author. And then I think the idea of also further, like, do you want to publish, right? Do you want to share this with the world? Do you want to put your own stories out there for other people to read? That's another aspect of it. And now more than ever is a good time to be able to do that, right? There, the gatekeepers are there in some ways, and for some people it is important to have representation by a publishing house and an agent. But you can also just write a story and post it on something Web 2.0 or Web 3.0, and get the word out via your Twitter account or your Instagram, and show people and have people read it, and then people might buy your work and read it, right, and even review it. So but persistency is important, right? Because you can get derailed. I mean, I'm no saint when it comes to making excuses to write. I have my things that interfere with that. But now that I've, like, the last Northman's 80,000 words, and I got it written, and I even made an audiobook of it. So it's like I had to work at that just piecemeal. My dad always used to say this saying. He's like, "How do you eat an elephant?" He's like, "One piece at a time." It's like, I'm sure a lot of people have heard that, but it's like, break it down, manageable steps, work consistently at it, and have fun, right? I mean, that's part of it, is like, enjoy it, right? You're creating something, you're putting, your ideas into words, and you're basically creating art. So that's it. And, your negative self-talk that most authors probably experience, like, is this good enough? I'm not good enough. I have that. And it's like, well, I see those thoughts, but I'm still going to pursue this. I'm still going to take action and take the steps to write and put stuff out there. And people might like it and they might not. I mean, back to wrestling, it's like, when you're writing a book, it's like, there's no guarantee that if you want to sell it, you're going to sell one copy. And I think wrestling conditioned me that way. And, maybe harshly, but not. But it's like, you can train for a decade or 2 decades or maybe three. And that doesn't mean, hey, you're going to win a national final, or you're going to go to the Olympics or win the Olympics, right? Whatever level of attainment you achieve, it is more about, for me, breaking down the wrestling that I did, it was like the friendships and the experiences and the life lessons and the journey of it, right? And the same thing I think is for writing, right? It's like, you can have a goal, and that's important, and the target, but if you can immerse yourself in the whole process and the whole experience, then that can carry you through sometimes what can be difficult times writing a book.
What's your kryptonite as a writer, speaking of difficult times?
Well, one of them is video games. So I think, I've always been a video game player. I think I was around. This is going to date me, but we had the Atari console, which was Pong in the 70s, I think, maybe the 80s. But you had these really old, archaic, what aren't archaic now, but game systems. So I've been playing video games all my life, and sometimes I have to make a conscious choice to resist the urge to play video games and write. And sometimes I'm successful, and sometimes I'm not. We talked about that dialogue, right? That self-talk. So, that's going to show up, and notice it, name it. Okay, let it go, and steer into what's important, right? And steer into the actual work. Um, I don't think sometimes ideas like how is this going to play out? How do I build this story? That can also be quite intimidating, right? Especially something lengthy like a novel, right? So, but the antidote to that, I think, is just look around, right? Like, go out your front door and look for a story, right? Or read a book, read a nonfiction book, read fiction, play video games, watch TV, talk to people, and all these sensory experiences, take them in, and like, what's a story, right? What can I write about this, or how does this fit in? So those are the ones that I contend with, um, for the most part, right? So.
How many books have you written up to this point, and do you have a favorite?
So I think The Last Northman, we've talked about a lot. That's my favorite book, largely because of the whole experience around it. It's been one hell of a journey, and I think it started, and obviously I had the idea sort of showed up to me when I was a little kid. I think to some degree, as if I go back far enough in my mind, but the um, the book itself really started to get put on a Word document around 2017. Um, and then I just persisted at it, wrote, rewrote, got someone to edit it, got better readers, and then I'm a firm believer, when you start pursuing something, it opens up, the path opens up, right? And it's almost like the universe wants you to be successful in whatever you aim at, right? To some degree. So just follow that path and move towards it. Um, I had a teammate of mine. His name is Gen, and we were roommates as well as teammates. And he messaged me one day. He's like, "Look, man, I don't like to read, but I'll listen to it." So then the hamster wheel in my head's like, "Well, maybe I should create audiobooks," right? So, I bought this mic, and I started doing the audio, and that's been a really good learning experience and a journey. It's not easy. I'm not necessarily the most detail oriented guy, so to try to get everything right was a challenge. But I think you need to push on things in life, and you need to have struggle, and you need to have to work hard at something, even if it's difficult or extremely difficult. Um, so all that said about The Last Northman, I think that's why it's my favorite piece. But I really like everything else I wrote, and I'm hoping other people enjoy it too. But it's a novella, which basically means it's about 40,000 words. So I couldn't conceptualize it being more. So I wrote it up, and it's about a long haul trucker, conservative, deep rooted conservative man. Somewhat traditional values, run and truck, across the northern U.S. And the setting, it's set in a sort of dystopian future where artificial intelligence has basically birthed and taken over to some degree. And then there's all these little subsets of technology, and he's an angry man. And I'm not an angry person, but I got to write as an angry person, and what people could be seeing that makes them angry, certainly with technological change. So that story just evolved right to the point of it's got a lot of interpersonal relationship aspects to it, where you really get to see Royal. The name of the novella is Royal, who's the character. His name is Royal. So I'm quite attached to him as well as a character. I wrote a lot of short stories. I think I wrote 5. So I wrote one called Blood Mist, I talked about. I wrote another one called The Cave, which is they're really short reads, and I wanted to create those for fun. It was a lot of fun. But hopefully people read those. It's an easy buy-in. I think it's like 99 cents USD, so you could have a risk-free experience. So back to the names. Then I wrote one called The Swim. I wrote a World War II piece about my grandfather, so that was pretty emotional for me to write that. It's called The Wellington, and it's about the brotherhood of men, and all those men that died during World War II, on both sides of the coin. And he didn't talk much about his experience in war, but he flew in Wellingtons over the North Sea through the Norwegian Trench, and they flared a lot of the German convoys that were shipping iron ore from Norway to the German war machine. And his craft was one that they would fly in and drop flares, and then the other bombers would come in and drop their payload on the vessels. And like most vets, he didn't talk about it much with us as kids, but I got to learn about the story through my family heritage. I talked to my aunt a lot about it, and she told me stories he would tell her classes. She was a teacher, so I got to learn that and tried to put that in the short story. And so that was a great dive into a little family history for me. And that one, I priced it at $5 as the ebook. It's audiobook as well, but all the sales for that, if anybody wants to check it out and buy it, are going to go to the Canadian Legion, particularly the branch closest to my home here in Ottawa. And for those listeners, the Legion is an organization that supports veterans in Canada, but it also supports in the seniors in the area and does community building. So all sales from that are going to lifetime go to this Legion to help them out. What else did I write? I tried to get out of my comfort zone. I wrote a love story, largely about a young man that's he's trying to figure out how to ask out this girl that he works with out on a date, and he's got his anxieties around it, but he kind of musters it up. And I tried to make it a fun story, which I need that because I write, considering what I do write, it's nice to balance it out with a little bit of love and kindness in there. So that was a good experience. What else have I written? And then the last one I've written is it's a science fiction take on the end of the world, which has been done to death, but it's called The Tether. And it's about, I don't know how to explain it without spoiling it, but it's basically, the main character in it is quite warm to my heart, and he encounters something bigger than he is, but there's a whole story to it. And so there's that. So yeah, all those are short stories, a lot of them, except for The Last Northman and Royal. So they're easy reads, easy access if you want to check out my style in a risk-free way. Because I think it's a big ask. I realize, asking for money for my art as well as time, right? Like, sure, someone can pay for a book, but to ask them to take 8 years of their life, and time is precious for all of us, and to read that is a big ask. But hopefully people find value and enjoyment in these stories. So.
What's your idea of success as a writer?
I think for me, success is more based in contentment. I've got a lot of stuff in my filing cabinet in my brain that I want to write. And that can also, back to my kryptonite, sometimes that can be a problem because I've got this story I'm working on, I've got that one I'm working on, and oh, this is a good idea. And I get sometimes pulled in different directions. But I think success will be when I can feel caught up, and maybe I never get there, right? Maybe I'm just on a treadmill of churning out ideas and stories, but who knows? I mean, so I'm working on that prequel to in the Vikings genre. And then I've got a book that I'm writing. It's a science fiction slash Western type book, dystopian novel, based largely on my experiences playing a game called Fallout, which I'm sure some of your listeners have played, but it's a futuristic end of the world dystopic place. Wasteland series, as well as another video game that's inspired me to write it. Some of the Stephen King, the Dark Tower series has also been influential. So it's basically going to be set after nuclear war and such, which is a genre that's out there, but it interests me. I think Fallout is one of my favorite games, and though it's terrifying to think that maybe that could be a reality for us, it's that. I'm writing another book called I don't know what the title is going to be, but it's basically a psychotherapist that treats alien species. So the inspiration for that book is in my undergrad, I had a course called Feeling and Emotion, my psychology undergrad, and our professor gives us this assignment one day, and she's like, look, you're going to write about how you're going to communicate with an alien species that doesn't necessarily have the same facial structure, the same mannerisms, or even obviously not the same language. He said, how would you know what it's feeling and thinking, and what kind of emotions it's going through? So this book will be largely based, I think So I bought this other book called, I forget the name of it, but it's basically a compendium of alien species. And then the artist, the book author's got art related to it. There's a one-page write-up. This is a benevolent species. This is a harmful species and such. And it describes where they're from. And I think he got it from Project Blue Book, which is, my friend keeps telling me I have to read it, but it's supposed to be this compendium of extraterrestrial species. So in the book, I'm going to write as a therapist, helping these alien species with their problems as best I can. So there's that. And then what else am I? And then so another direction I'm getting pulled in, it's my own fault, but one of my teammates lives in Arizona, and he and I are working on a project where we're writing. So we have developed their characters and we're writing each other letters. And his name is Luigi Bianco, and he's always been big on writing postcards and letters, and wherever I was in the world, or wherever he was, he would send out these postcards, right? Like, I'm in Mexico, and he'd send this thing, I'm doing this. And he's big on the written word, right? He's like, we got to bring that back, we got to bring writing letters back. So what we do is, I have my character who's set in a certain setting in this fantasy world, and he's got his, and I wrote him a letter, penned it out on paper, and mailed it, which was an incredible experience to go through, because it's kind of like, it's old school, and then he received it, and then he sent me one back, and I read it, and we're communicating. We've got these ideas and these goals that we got to work together, and the novel is going to be just our correspondence, our letters back and forth. We're going to publish it eventually in a final book. So I got lots to do. So to answer your question about like success, I think it's just me feeling content and feeling like I've gotten all the projects out of my mind and onto publication that I can, right? And so there's that. And if I sell them along the way, then that would be helpful. But it's more about getting it out there.
There's the cover of The Tether.
Yeah. Yeah. So to give people perspective, there's a character. His name is Samuel Smith, and that's his boat, the Jolly Jellyfish. And there's a situation in the short story that doesn't go well, and he tries to fix it and goes from there. So.
As far as social media, how do you use social media to help sell books?
So there's an entrepreneur. She's an author, but also an entrepreneur named Joanna Penn, and I've read some of her books on publishing and being an author. And one of the things, she wrote a book, I think it's called Marketing for Authors, which it's a bit dated now, considering we're moving into things beyond Web 2.0, right? There's going to be innovation. There's going to be different ways to publish, which I think she's got a current book on Web 3.0. But she talked about the use of social media as like advertising and ways to generate readership. So my strategy, I have Twitter, I have Facebook, which I largely keep to people I know, and then Instagram. So those are my big three. Sometimes I wonder what it'd be like to be a Snapchatter, or I don't know what else there is. I'm sure there's other ones, but
What's your handles on those platforms?
to be honest, I don't know. But if you go, they're all set up on lighterthanpapers.com. That's like my flagship. So it's got my books, it's got my socials, it's got my podcast, I've got a little bit of a blog going. So everything's there. But yeah, I don't even know. Actually, I should know what my handles are. But the links are all there to Twitter and Instagram. And but I just mass post, right? I'm working on this, I worked on that. I might put like a synopsis up, or a paragraph up, or I might post my dog licking my face as I'm trying to write, right? Just to try to generate that buzz, right? And I kind of fluctuate between periods of a lot of social media posting, and then times where I step away from it. So that's kind of what I use it for, is to try to generate a buzz and an interest and get the word out. So.
Do you think, stepping away from the author, before we close it down here, if MMA had been more lucrative after your amateur wrestling career, do you think you would have tried it?
Probably not. I fantasize about that sometimes. I've got friends that are, getting into jiu-jitsu, and post wrestling, and a friend of mine tried to convince me to enter the veteran world championships, which I said I just didn't have the bandwidth or time, so I couldn't commit to training for it. But one of the things I had to contend with as a wrestler is I got big blood vessels in my nose, I think, and I bleed when the wind blows on my nose. So I would probably always have a bloody nose and wouldn't work. My friend says I might not have a good chin, but I haven't taken too many blows to the head to know, but probably not. But it's a good fantasy. I like it, right? It's such a glorified, well, it's not glorified, but it's glorious, right? Like to see these guys go in there and mix it up. And, um, but I probably wouldn't have, no.
Yeah, I haven't been knocked out, but I've had a lot of concussions, so I don't know if a good chin makes that much of a difference as far as brain damage.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate catching up with you, and I wish you good luck on all of your books, including your latest. And I'll let you shut this down with whatever you want to say and whatever you want to plug.
Well, I want to say thank you to you for having me on and giving me this opportunity to get my art out there to the world. And anybody that feels like they want to read my stuff, I'd be very grateful. Reviews are always fantastic. If you find you like it and you want to add a review to it, that would be great. And if not, that's cool too. And yeah, and I think I hope I inspire other people to write, right, and or if anything, pursue dreams beyond, maybe an athletic career. What's the next step for me? What can I pursue? What else is out there for me as part of that? And yeah, man. And one more thing, we have to do a podcast, you and I, one more time, and that part two on my channel when you're up for it. So,
Yeah, one of these days for sure. And you do a podcast too. What brought you into wanting to do that?
um, I see yours, so I see your stuff. I started to listen to them. I like Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman. I listened to Jordan Peterson's podcast. A few others, and I thought, wow, this is kind of neat. And I just like meeting people and talking to people. So there's that. I cut my teeth on friends, and sometimes that might be a bit too close to home, but like talking to people that I already know. But people have fascinating stories when you sit and listen to them, right? And you're with them. And I think that's why I do it. It's just a lot of fun. Um, and it's a challenge, right? It's something to take on and and challenge myself to learn and get better at. And yeah, so that's it. But
And they can check the links out to that, including the one you did with me, on your